I see a lot of slander and discourse online about shipping. Some of it valid, but some of it also dismissive and a bit disingenuous, especially around queer ships in fandom. I also feel like even in 2020, it's a bit of a taboo subject. It's like the part of the fandom that creators acknowledge, but only enough to still maintain getting money without actually acknowledging the existence of queerness. But even though the public side of fandom and creators and networks don't particularly like to associate with queer pairings and headcanons and culture in fandom, that doesn't change the fact that it persists. It's strong and growing, and I'd argue that it's almost the backbone of every fandom online. The power of these ships and the culture and these fandoms in general is kind of terrifying and awe-inspiring. They've inspired so many creators, whether it be from art to music to writing, and they've spawned thousands of micro communities and events. I would even argue that queer ships get a larger following than a lot of the straight ones in canon. But take this table for example. It's a list of the most popular pairings written in fanfiction, but I think it's still a good indicator of the popularity of a lot of ships on a popular site for transformative works called Archive of Our Own, AO3 for short. Now here's the same table for 2019, 2017, 2016, 2015. Notice something here? Oh yeah, the gays. So why? Why? These are shows where more often than not there are confirmed relationships in canon, and a lot of them are straight ones. Why don't fans seem to enjoy or support those as much as their own headcanoned queer ones? Why are all the most popular ships gay, specifically MLM, when queer representation in these shows is so minimal themselves? What inspires this? What instigates this phenomenon in general? This is what I want to explore. I've seen a lot of other creators tackle the subject, namely Sarah Z with her gay fanfiction video, and I've linked a lot of those below. But what I want to look into more is why gay ships in general, and why MLM more so than WLW or straight ships. And we don't really say slash fiction anymore either, do we? I think a slash has quite a few negative connotations around it. It was again something that a lot of people saw happening in fandom and were kind of disgusted by. I mean, even though media pretend things are easy for queer people in 2020, it's quite evident that they're not. And just 10 years ago, you could be vilified and crucified online for writing MLM fiction. I think that's a tangent that I don't really know what to do with. Let's not get into that. So ships. What is shipping? What are ships? Ships are basically romantic pairings, and I would argue they're a lot of the backbone of fandom culture online, both in the early days of fandom culture from the 80s to now. The creator of that table that I referenced at the start, Centrum Lumina, or Lulu as they refer to themselves, added this to a post regarding the popularity of MLM ships in the top 20 ships in that data list. Of course, it's also possible that there's something about AO3 which is skewing the results, but that's a whole other series of questions. AO3 has only been around a few years and doesn't include many older fandoms. Has f/f fandom died down in the last few years? Or if the f/f fans are still around and posting somewhere else, then why don't they seem to feel welcome on a popular multi-fandom archive? These are really valid criticisms of the dataset that I'll be referencing quite frequently. I really wish I did have more statistics available to me from websites like fanfiction.net or LiveJournal. However, even if those were present, a lot of fics have since disappeared from the site, perhaps due to people growing up and cringing at their old writing and past selves, maybe even with website hacks, and just with time itself. So I did want to reference that post just to acknowledge that there are flaws in the dataset that I'll be using to extract a lot of my analysis, but also despite those flaws, I do think there are lots of interesting trends to be observed. The trend of MLM ships being vastly more popular than straight ships or sapphic ships is just an observable thing, and I think that's evident to anyone in fandom culture. If you join maybe the subreddit for your favorite shows, you'll find a lot of people talking about the MLM ship. more so than a lot of the other canon confirmed ships. Even like Sarah Z observed in her video, foundation for a lot of the online culture surrounding Star Trek, and then consequently a lot of other fandoms that cannoned off, came from the fascination around one of the big MLM ships in that show. I think even though the data has its limitation, a lot of what I'm saying still has its validity, even if just as a point of starting conversation, more so than fact. None of what I'm saying is fact. It's just speculation from lived experience. I think I'm outing myself again. So from the data compiled, we can see a clear pattern in the popular ships online, right? And notably, the aversion of female characters in these ships in their entirety. Is this a sexism? Well, yes, but also no. Internalized sexism, baby. What do I mean by this? I mean specifically the rhetoric surrounding femininity and what it means to be a woman that society spews at young girls from early on, who then have to digest and internalize all of these toxic ideas. From a young age, women are taught to hate themselves and hate other women for whatever reason, be it that women are superficial, money and makeup obsessed, they're manipulative, shallow, villains. Sometimes this makes it hard to then enjoy female characters and their relationships in media. I'm referencing a study which I will show on screen now, which surveyed 1,200 of the most popular films in this year. And one notable observation I want to pull out from this study is that in media, from the age of 13, women see themselves becoming increasingly and incessantly sexualized. Women experience their sexuality being used as a commodity for societal, and specifically for male, consumption from such an early age. And from that early age, we're taught to detest this and criminalize it when we see it in other women. Consequently, teenagers in this weird nebulous between being a child and being an adult find themselves often uncomfortable with their own sexuality and in how to explore female sexuality. So maybe some of them prefer to write MLM ships. And let me make it clear, the media does not help with this issue either. Let's face it, straight ships are sometimes just boring. Is this because of a sexism again? Female characters sometimes just aren't interesting or written to be three-dimensional. Because of how often flat female characters come across, they don't always lend themselves to the popular and exciting dynamics, archetypes that shipping lends itself towards. Think enemies to lovers, or intense rivals, or friends separated by a war, or soulmates across past lives. I feel like I'm exposing myself a little bit here, but these are just some of the archetypes that shipping fawns over and festers around. There are reasons people are drawn to these types of dynamics, largely because of the intense emotions and dramas surrounding these relationships that convey across the screen so effectively that viewers are just drawn in. They're just more engaging and interesting. Those dynamics are often provided towards the better written male characters. I think this reasoning is also evident in the few sapphic ships that do become popular and were in this list. For example, Klexa from the 100. They're two incredibly complex and brilliant and clever, but also incredibly burdened by the expectations from their communities, drawn to each other, but also have conflicts from their responsibility to their family and friends, and then their growing responsibilities towards each other. Het ships don't give you that. Straight ships just lack some of that flavor. So sometimes, even if a female character is present and interesting, the romance is so poorly written that it's just not engaging. Think John and Mary from Sherlock. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this ship itself because I think H-Bomb's video on Sherlock in general is a fantastic articulation of why it. But in its essence, the relationship is confusing and badly written, even though Mary herself is quite an interesting character and fans would have wanted to know more about her. Maybe not in the way the writers chose to, but again, we're not getting into that. Hence, people find the relationship between Sherlock and his best friend John a lot more interesting than between John and Mary, because the best friend relationship is one that, again, has a lot of those emotions and drama that I mentioned earlier, but it's also just a stronger foundation than the writers gave John and Mary. Or perhaps there's no real romantic relationship in the show at all, and there's a bit of subtle queer coding of the characters, like Sarah Z mentioned in her video about gay fanfiction. The writers sometimes give Dean lines like referencing a gay bar that, though the average viewer may not pick up on, the queer ones who are familiar with some of the references would immediately notice and recognize the characters potentially being open to then shipping in queer relationships. This leads fans to then perhaps pick out characters from a recurring set, such as Castiel. Here, Castiel was such an interesting figure that elicited a lot of emotional drama from Dean, that it wasn't that hard to project a romantic relationship onto that, because the dynamic was engaging, it was fun to watch play on screen, and it had a lot of tension and real weight towards it. And then there are tropes like Styles and Derek from Teen Wolf, and I would honestly put Keith and Lance from Voltron, Legendary Defender, in the same category as well. Both feature a sort of unlucky in love character, namely Lance and Styles. Both spent a lot of their initial time on screen chasing after an unattainable female character who, more often than not, treated them with a lot of indifference and was uncomfortable in the thought of a romantic relationship between them. Consequently, fans look for a romantic conclusion for these characters elsewhere, in Keith and Derek, who, for better or worse, provided tension and drama and intrigue in their dynamics with the characters. These pairings have vicious spats of dialogue on screen that are witty and engaging and tumultuous. They're like fireworks and roller coasters as they come together. Is it any surprise that people then project a romantic relationship onto that, when there's so much more there than there was with any of their female counterparts? Especially when these characters almost tend to mirror each other, actually end up sharing more in common than either of them thought, and obsess over each other in such a fixated and intense way. A way that could have more potential. Listen, me and my homies love enemies to friends to lovers. So, straight pairings are either boring or non-existent, leading fans to look elsewhere. Why is elsewhere for the male characters? Don't female characters have promising relationships for themselves elsewhere? Of that investigation I referenced earlier of the 12,000 films surveyed in 2019, 31% of them had females with speaking roles. Even fewer of them were people of color. It's no surprise that for media where the male characters are more established and represented and better written to the audience, that they become characters we enjoy more and hence want to project relationships onto. They're closer to real people and hence connect with fans in a way that female characters in the same shows often don't. So they become the ones fans are interested in and want a romantic conclusion for. The three most popular sapphic ships are Regina and Emma Swan from Once Upon a Time, Clark and Lexa from The 100, and Cara Danvers and Lena Luthor from Supergirl, or the DC Universe in extension. And these are all from shows with a female protagonist and with well-developed female side characters. Supernatural, Sherlock, and Teen Wolf, the most popular fandoms for the MLM ships, all had male protagonists and a mostly male cast and male side characters and friendships. So in shows where you're given interesting and engaging female characters, both the protagonists themselves and in side characters, fans do see the potential for sapphic ships and engage with them thoroughly online. There, however, is still an enormous disparity between the amount of fics written for the most popular MLM ship than there is for the most popular femslash ship. As I mentioned before, fan fiction statistics shouldn't necessarily equate to the popularity of the ship in fandom in general, but I think they are a good indicator or estimation of how the ship is regarded in fandom. Fics are often written with the intention to be popular. Maybe not consciously, but writing a popular fic is more rewarding. There's more interaction. You're encouraged to continue writing because of how many more people view your work. And in more popular ships, there are also more writers, more diversity of tropes, situations. Quality of writing is also often better with a larger pool, and so it's more engaging for readers as well. So I do think this is a justifiable means of estimation. And these are the only helpful statistics I have available, so we'll roll with it. So, who is writing these fics? Is it just people fetishizing over queer ships, or is it something else? There's been an attempt at creating a census for people on AO3, and it's one of the only attempts I could find. It only surveyed 10,000 people, but I think that's still quite a large amount. And it has other limitations, which again, creator Lulu very kindly went through, and I will link that post and show it here, detailing all the potential limitations of the use of the data. Some other limitations, which I don't think she mentioned, were language barriers. I'm pretty sure the census was only done in English, and if you go on AO3, there's a surprising amount of Mandarin fics and Spanish fics, again proving shipping is global. And the census was also promoted on Tumblr almost solely, which could again lead to an overrepresentation of certain groups who are more likely to go on Tumblr, in contrast to the people who use AO3 in extension. But it still got a lot of responses and provides a lot of really interesting insight into the people who could be behind a lot of these fics, or are the type of people who would read these fics, and can be analysed within those confines. These results are really interesting. Again, so grateful for Lulu for all this work. Now, I do believe the results would be different if they were somewhere on Wattpad, because Wattpad, yeah, especially the age category. But within this sample, we do have some possible further or alternate explanations for the phenomenon of MLM shipping. Okay, so some really interesting statistics, well, I think at least, and I highly recommend you read the whole post if you have the interest or time, is that the average age of respondents was 25 years old, and what Lulu pointed out was that the older the reader, the less likely they were to read F/F. Also, a majority of people, 55%, identified as belonging to a gender, sexual, or romantic minority. And this is a really ugly image, but Lulu titled it The Changing Face of Fandom, which was showing that the gender and sexual identity of under 18s was a lot more diverse than the gender and sexuality of over 30s, and implying that in the future of fandom this trend could be continuing. And Lulu also broke down gender and sexuality demographics by fic category, said that F/F fans are more likely to be bi, pan, or homosexual women than heterosexual women. S/M fans are more likely to be heterosexual women. Gen fans are more likely to be asexual women or asexual non-binary people than bi, pan, or heterosexual women. And lastly, M/M fans are less likely to be heterosexual women and more likely to be bi/pansexual women, based on this data. And I want to add on to this. For some of my friends, writing fics has been a way of exploring their own thoughts and feelings, and sexuality and gender by extension. It's low risk, you don't have to go to a publisher, you don't have to get anyone's approval really on writing these, but there's a high reward with the immense amount of fandom engagement when you then pick popular ships though. So that could be a potential reason for the existence of a lot of queer ships, or at least why so many people may seek them out. For many of us, because representation in books is way more likely than it ever was in on-screen, network-produced TV or film. We seek out representation in writing, and then when writing online again has even less hurdles and barriers to entry than writing through a publisher, representation is far more likely, and for many people that's the first time they really get to see or hear portrayals of themselves. So It also seems like, from Lulu's observations, a lot of non-binary people and women are the ones writing these fics. Why do so many of them write MLM, which is from a different perspective than the one they live in? Well, maybe that is it. Maybe it's escapism. I mentioned before that from a young age, women are taught to criminalize his sexuality and criminalize female sexuality in other women. Maybe this is one of the only ways women or non-binary people feel comfortable writing about romance and sexuality through a societally accepted and popular male point of view. Another reason, which is similar, and this is stealing from one of my close friends, is she told me that when she was first exploring her own sexuality and feelings towards other women, she experienced a sort of high aversion for femininity and hence felt more comfortable in male POVs and male fictional characters in general. Gender and sexuality and how we internalize those concepts are so complex, and there's things we are still unpacking as we grow up. I don't think we ever fully understand how they've affected us. And so I think it's quite disingenuous and dismissive to label everyone who reads or writes queer fan fiction as fetishizing. Not that those people don't exist, but I think it's dismissive to generalize. So the popularity of MLM is a combination of sexism, better well-rounded characters, more focus from the media these characters feature in on their relationships with other male characters, and perhaps the shipper's own gender and sexuality. And then consequently, because of how popular MLM ships then become, they're kind of what you see when you first join a new fandom. They become normalized, this constant and familiar part of the show or fandom you engage with. And I think that's why for a lot of shippers they find it easier to ship MLM ships than less popular sapphic ships. These ships, as I mentioned, also then tend to build up a large following, which is why it's then rewarding for creators to make better fan art or write fics, because there's a potential for a much higher reward, which in turn gives the potential for higher quality of these works, which then brings in more fans to those specific ships, maybe even before hearing the show. I've seen so many people on Twitter and Tumblr being like, oh, I discovered this show because I saw a really good piece of fan art, or I read a really amazing fic and that's why I started following this ship and this show. So I don't think any of these things exist in isolation, more of a combination. And yes, I do still think one of the reasons is straight girls with fetishes, but it is dismissive and disingenuous to generalize everyone under that umbrella. But it's also very important to focus on the consequence of the popularity of MLM ships as potentially creating environments that are uncomfortable and toxic for queer men. I see a lot of the focus on criminalizing straight girls with fetishes, as they're labeled, who write these fics, and less on focusing on the stereotypes they portray that are damaging and harmful to men who like men. And not to mention how they hurt queer people of color who are barely represented in those statistics that I showed. I think again this can be attributed to the lack of representation of queer people of color in the first place, especially in the most popular fandoms to write on. However, when you join places like Tumblr and AO3 and see only certain brands of queer pushed at you, it can be quite alienating. And that brings me to my last point on MLM ships. Sometimes, because we are shown these ships as the most acceptable ones, they become the standard of what we praise and support. With internalized sexism, we normalize male POVs so much that even for women sometimes they'll write through male POVs because that's what we're conditioned to respond to as giving situations the depth they require. Men are always our heroes and protagonists. It's not surprising that this is then propagated in fandom itself. Hence, MLM may be what people find themselves subconsciously supporting. Maybe that's also why this particular support is so much stronger and louder for MLM ships than it is for straight ships as well. The solace and feeling of community one finds in shipping these pairings is so much more precious. especially when a lot of the people shipping these pairings may find themselves to be outcasts because of their own gender or sexuality, general interests. Believe it or not, liking Supernatural, though a personality trait on Tumblr, didn't really make you popular offline. We love to hate on kids, especially teenage girls and their interests. And so when you come online and find people who share these aspects of your life and actually enjoy the things you enjoy, it's no surprise that what you then have there is so much more valuable and precious, and the feelings you feel are that much more heightened. And these in turn extend to the pairings that you're shipping, which could explain the intense culture around a lot of these ships themselves. Now, that's not to say that every queer ship gets its popularity from societal discrimination. Sometimes it's just a well-written pairing with a lot of potential, and as people who gravitate to good stories, that's where the fandom finds itself naturally inclining towards. Sometimes we just gravitate to good stories. Queerness second to that. Personally, I do think with a lot of these pairings, there is a little more to it than that. But whatever that thing specifically is probably different for everyone. End of the day, a lot of these ships are kind of wholesome. Not all though. And the people behind them are still just people. I don't see what instigates a lot of the slander these ships bring across. Well, not in every case at least. There are some fandoms with an incredibly toxic culture, and when this goes beyond the fandom, it often has disastrous consequences, especially to a lot of the voice actors, or actors in general, and creators who work on these works. I think a lot of what shippers and fandom forget, especially when they are younger and just learning about the entertainment industry, or maybe when they're not from America, and the censorship laws in their own country are quite different from the ones networks in America use or face, is that they tend to blame the creators and the actors for actions that are outside of their control and often are imposed by the networks or governments themselves. Things are changing though, and queer ships are getting a lot more attention, for better or for worse. I hope better. Again, not all representation is good representation, but I think things are getting better. I don't know. Those are just some of the reasons that I think why gay ships are so popular. In fandom at least. Let me know your thoughts below. In conclusion, give more wholesome support to sapphic ships. Bye. Leave a like and comment as offering to the algorithm. Okay, thanks, bye.